glad you're here. I hope you're as excited as we are about this this evening with Jason, with Dr. Jason Sugg, actually. How about that? So I'm going to go ahead and just start a little bit here while people are coming in. Jason and I actually have known each other for a little over a decade, and it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to watch him and get to know him. And he's currently in private practice with his LPC here in Austin, in addition to being a researcher and an activist. And he talks about, I love his words, so let me use them. He has completed his dissertation, which he's turning into a book, on the impact of urban form and ritual on relations between beings. And he's focused on what he calls relational ecopsychology. And then he says that in his spare time, you can find him outdoors somewhere, camping somewhere wild. He lives in Austin with his two, he didn't say this, but adorable daughters who are just wonderful. And he holds a BS and a master's in engineering in computer science from MIT, and then he's got a master's and a PhD from Pacifica. So you've really woven together the left side and the right side of the brain and done this fascinating dance that I'm excited that you're going to be able to tell us about. So thanks for being here. We'll also hear more about what's happening at JSA this summer from Melinda later on at the end of our time. And if you join us often, you know that Daniel will be our guide through a lot of tonight, and Sandy Wilcox and Daniel, Melinda, and I are all part of the board of JSA, welcoming you here again for this exciting adventure. Thanks, everybody. Daniel?
Oh, I don't have much to add. Thanks for the introduction. And we're really excited to hear Jason give the talk. I don't think I have anything to add, though. Really excited to see you all. Thanks for hanging in. If you do want to ask a question, maybe you can, we have about 28 people registered for the event tonight. So just to kind of help us out, maybe we can use the hand raise function. Instead of just unmuting yourself and shouting out, maybe you can give us a little heads up so we can keep everything under control, but we'd really appreciate that. Other than that, make yourself at home, ask good questions, and get your thinking cap ready. It's about 7:04. We'll probably wait just another minute and then maybe get started at 7:05.
Let me just add then, one of the things that I don't think I mentioned was that some of you who have been around JSA for a while probably remember that Jason has presented multiple times with us, and he was on the board for at least 5 years. And you would remember him, among other things, as being the person that sent out emails and was present and helpful for many of our sessions. So Jason, thank you for that. It was wonderful and helpful.
Well, maybe we should go ahead and get started. It's about 7:05.
All right.
Take it away.
Thank you. I'm gonna let me just hey Daniel, it says the screen sharing's disabled.
Oh, of course. Okay. There you go. Try it now.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. All right. Can everybody see that? Thumbs up. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you for the introduction there, Joe and Daniel, for keeping us on track here technically. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited about this. I guess, Daniel, everybody's going to be muted automatically.
Not automatically. Maybe we should just request. But it looks like everyone's already muted. At least.
Okay. So just going to ask that everybody just keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. That'll just help cut down on the kind of environmental noise. We're going to have a break about halfway through to, like go to the bathroom or get a drink of water or whatever. But please feel free, if you need to before that, to just, take care of yourself. Move your body, get a drink, whatever. There'll be a Q&A period at the end. But if you have questions as we go, I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and ask them. And Daniel, if you could keep an eye on people like raising their hand. It's a little hard with my screen set up for me to track the gallery view, but I will be tracking the chat, so you can pop a question in the chat as we go. Or maybe Daniel, if you see a hand go up, you can just alert me.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
So hopefully everyone got that either chat or raise hand feature, and then we'll figure it out.
Yep. All right. Any questions to start with on any of this? Okay. Well, I would imagine that it's clear to most of the people here tonight. I mean, if you're coming to this talk, it's probably clear that we modern humans are living through an unprecedented and really massive shift in the ways that we relate to the world around us. When you look at the way we lived 50 years ago, there are huge differences. And when you go back 100, 200, or 1,000 years, the shifts are massive, right? It would really be mind-boggling, except that we've grown so used to this incredible pace of change that's kind of at odds with our genetics. They've done research on some of the ancient cave paintings in Europe using carbon dating and analyses of consistent themes in the work. And the conclusion was that human culture and modes of living in that area were stable and mostly unchanging for 25,000 years. That's 5 times recorded history, right? Wrap your mind around that. Now, fast forward to the present day. And 100 years ago, my sharecropper grandparents were riding in horse-drawn wagons and living on subsistence farming. And today, at least in America, almost everybody needs a car to get around, and our lives are really dominated by digital technology in a way that was inconceivable 100 years ago. So that's a really radical change in a very short time frame, right? Our mode of living is almost entirely different. And that change has thrown all our old beliefs about the world into disarray, right? As our mode of living has shifted so drastically, our ways of relating to the world around us have shattered. Our rituals, our spirituality, our connection to the earth have all lost their meaning. And with that shift, we're seeing disastrous consequences for the broader non-human world, right? I mean, global climate change is the most conspicuous and the most talked about. But what's talked about less is the fact that we're in the midst of a mass extinction event, the likes of which have only been seen a handful of times in the history of life on the planet, right? Mass extinction, the technical definition, means that the planet is losing 3/4 of its total species in a geologically short time span. This is unfolding right now, and it's driven by the way we modern humans relate to the world around us. So obviously, those are really huge and very complicated issues that we won't be able to unpack tonight. But it's important to keep in mind that all of these things are happening in a feedback loop with a world of ideas, and that much of the shape of modern life that we find ourselves in has its roots in those ideas. And that's where our focus is really going to be tonight, on the ideas that drive this disconnect from the world and the way those ideas have shaped our modes of life. Right. Our focus is really going to be especially on the realm of psychology, but we'll talk about some other places as well. Now, this can be kind of heady stuff. I'm going to do my best to keep it relatable. And we're going to have some journaling exercises around how all of this shows up in your own day-to-day life, because I think it's really important that we be tracking the ways that these old ideas continue to shape how we move in the world. So one big idea that is exceptionally important to this story is this dualistic view of the world that separates all the world's phenomena into these two categories of nature and culture, right? Probably everybody understands this distinction. Culture we understand as the universe of human activities, attitudes, institutions, rituals, all that, right? Nature is the world of the wild and non-human, and in modern times, we view it as a mechanical world filled with soulless dead matter, right? And we see these as two separate domains with totally different rules. And that distinction between nature and culture is probably the single biggest driver of how we relate to the non-human world. And this is very true also of depth psychology, which has really developed over the last 120 years or so in parallel with all those changes in technology and society that we mentioned a moment ago, right? From Freud on, this field has generally been concerned with the world of culture and viewed the world of nature suspiciously. This is less true of Jung, but not completely. Every major school of depth psychology, Jung included, has viewed culture and relations between humans the primary concern of psychology, and generally treated the world of nature as secondary, both in its own right and in its importance to human well-being. And that approach puts us at odds with almost every other culture in history. And it's worth noting that this division has gone hand in hand with that other notorious dualism between mind and body that gets talked about a lot more these days, right? Culture is associated with mind and nature with body. And though this is changing now, historically, depth psychology has been more concerned with mind than with body. And what this time in history really seems to be calling for, and what we'll be working towards tonight, is a different kind of psychology, right? A psychology that doesn't separate our experiences of the world into these two different realms. Right? We might say that we're going to be working on a relational psychology for an animated world. This phrase, relational psychology, is something that has appeared in the last 30 or 40 years, especially in psychoanalytic circles, the approaches that descended directly from Freud. The Jungian approach has always had this relational piece more built in. But on the psychoanalytic side, there's been a really definitive shift, really driven by attachment theory, away from thinking about humans as isolated individuals with these inner drives or instincts that were the primary drivers of their psychologies, and towards thinking about humans as always embedded in webs of relationships that are essential to our development and our ongoing functioning. In the psychoanalytic world, you'll hear people talking about going from a one-person psychology to a two-person psychology. And this is important to us tonight because what we're really talking about in ecology are relationships, right? We're not isolated beings separate from the world. We're experiencing humans in relationship with a bunch of different entities in the world. And so this idea that humans develop and operate in relational contexts is going to be really important for us to keep in mind. But in the relational psychoanalysis movement, they're really only considering relationships with other humans. Is there anybody in this virtual room who doesn't have any kind of important relationship with someone or something non-human? Raise your hand, you can have your money back. Right? So why do we pretend in psychology that the only relationships that matter are with other people? When I say animated world, I mean a world that is seen as ensouled. That's a complicated word, but I'm really using it in the sense of a world where we can perceive some essence or independent subjectivity in many or even all of the objects around us, right? Now, for most of us that have grown up at this point in Western civilization, this is a very foreign idea, right? It might even make us a bit uncomfortable as we're talking about it. Because we all have this idea that goes back at least to Descartes in the 17th century, 400 years ago or so, that the world is split into these two realms, right? On the one hand is a world of matter, what he called res extensa, and on the other is a world of mind, res cogitans, and they're separate. And the world of matter is a dead realm where everything is built from little particles bumping around in predictable ways according to mathematical laws, while the world of mind is unique to humans. And it's taken a long time, actually, centuries, to even get to the point where we include all humans in that, right? And somehow this realm of mind is magically independent from the realm of matter, and the realm of matter magically independent from the realm of mind. This material realm, res extensa, included, by the way, the human body and all animals, who Descartes viewed as soulless automata that were just mindlessly following mechanical instinct. So you can see in this the way that this division has created a sense that we humans are the only real subjectivities in the world, right? I have my mind, it's somehow magically contained in and associated with my body, and everything else out there, even animals, pets, wild animals, everything else is just this dead matter, soulless. But this doesn't actually match most people's experience of things, right? And it's also at odds with a lot of, with a growing body of evidence from a bunch of different places that suggest two things. The first is that we now know that lots of different beings exhibit many of the signs of intelligence that we've always thought of as human, right? We see tool making and rituals in primates and corvids. We see these incredible networks of communication between plants. You'll hear talk about the mesosomal or rhizomal networks in forests and whatnot. And we see these highly adaptive strategies in a bunch of different species to threats from all kinds of places, right? And there's a lot of zoological evidence that at least some species of non-human animals learn non-instinctual behaviors from previous generations. So knowledge can get passed down from generation to generation in a way that really looks a lot like what we understand as culture. And if there's this kind of intelligence in all these non-human places, then this Cartesian division of the world just isn't right. The second thing is that there's lots of evidence now that something that we've all had a sense of for a while is true, right? That we humans perceive the world as though it were animated. Implicitly, we view the things around us as having some kind of personality or character, and we tend to interact with things as though they were other beings, right? We name our cars. We yell at our computers like they were people, right? We say things like, that lamp really spoke to me, right? There's some irrational and mostly unconscious part of our mind that tends to just automatically personify the things around us. Right? And there's a lot of research evidence for this coming from a bunch of different areas, neuro and cognitive sciences, but also cultural anthropology, social robotics, business marketing, and elsewhere. So it's really a widespread conclusion that's being come to right now. So what does a psychology look like that takes account of these things, right? What are the basic tenets of any psychology? Pictures of human nature, psychopathology, and treatment look like for a world that is animated rather than composed of dead matter, right? So much of modern psychology seems to be about reconciling ourselves to a small vision of the world that sees any perception of non-human otherness as kind of magical thinking, rather than embracing that larger view of the world and then helping people encounter and deconstruct what blocks them from experiencing that larger animated world. So we're going to pause here and do our first journaling exercise. So, hopefully you have your pen and paper at the ready. And these are just going to be some quick free association writing exercises. But first, maybe everybody just make sure you tend to your body, like plant your feet on the ground, get in a comfortable posture, take a couple of deep breaths. Might close your eyes and really feel yourself, right? Feel your breath, feel what's happening in your shoulders, your chest, your gut. Maybe wiggle your toes a little bit to bring all that energy down out of our heads. So we're going to start by taking 1 minute, and I'll call when time is up. And just make a list as fast as you can of all the associations that come to mind when you hear the word nature. It can be just be a word or a phrase. Just write just as quickly as you can. Write down as many as you can. So 1 minute. All right. So just finish up whatever you're writing down. And the second exercise, same deal, but now with the word culture. Write down as fast as you can all the associations that come to mind. 1 minute. All right. So now, as you look back over these two lists, what do you notice? What sensations, images, thoughts, feelings do you notice as you hold in your mind these two ideas of nature and culture? Just take another minute and just write down whatever comes up here. All right. And last bit here. What rules do you think you were using to distinguish these two categories? And as you look over them now, I wonder if there are things that come to mind that don't fit so neatly into these two categories. So let's just take 2 more minutes and just jot down whatever comes. All right. So I wonder what came up for people around this. Anybody? I mean, got anything that feels worthy of sharing here?
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
This is Roberta in Waverly.
Hi, Roberta.
Hi. This is a very interesting topic to me for several reasons. My son was 50 last year, and when we were taking him to the beach as a little boy, I experienced something had to name echo angst. And that is, I was horrified that to see all the trash on the at the ocean on the beach. And I was wondering about what was wrong in society that we were trashing this beautiful world we were a part of. And I wasn't aware that people were writing about this sense of anxiety that we were losing something, or we were out of touch with nature and we were trashing it and disrespecting it. And your topic seems to, that's what came up in my reflections. I think I've been privileged to be in what you would call culture in the city in the winter for education, but able to go to the country in the summer and go to the beach and be in nature. So I don't particularly feel a split. I feel I've been privileged to be able to be in both places, but it has horrified me that so many people have lost touch with the beauty of nature and what for me is the very sustaining qualities of nature.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's really hard to watch right now, isn't it?
It really is. Are you familiar with the John Freeman interview of Jung near the end of his life? And John Freeman said to Jung, what is the most important thing that you have learned in your lifetime of work? And without hesitation, Jung said, live in harmony with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I have referenced that statement by him many, many times because I think he knew something, or he was sensing something that you seem to be alerting us all to also.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roberta.
Welcome.
Anybody else?
Rebecca has her hand up.
Yeah, I was struck. I kind of free associated and made the lists without overthinking much. And I noticed that everything in my nature category was not human made, and everything in my culture category was human made, as if humans are not a part of nature. So I noticed a rule when you asked about criteria. I noticed that I had this implicit rule operating that I wasn't fully aware of. Yeah, and that really struck me. I also noticed kind of a distinction between kind of designed aesthetics in the culture category, like architecture, art, urban planning, that kind of thing, music, so sort of designed aesthetics, and then in the culture category, and then beauty, just, naturally occurring beauty in the nature category. And I was interested in the distinction between those as well.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
It looks like Karina also has a question or a comment. Karina?
Hi. As it pertains to your last question, does anything come to mind that doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories? I actually wrote humans. I feel like we don't fit into our current culture. The culture doesn't fit us anymore. It feels like that way. And I also feel like when we've been so far apart from nature that we don't know how to be in it either. So we're kind of outcasts at this point. At least that's how it feels to me.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that can be this way that it can feel like we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner with that. Yeah. That's great. We're going to talk a little bit about that idea later tonight. But yeah, I appreciate that. So we're probably a little tight on time at this point. So, hopefully you're coming away from that exercise with a sense that these ideas are really pervasive and that they're largely unconscious, right? Most people don't sit back and scratch your chin and wonder, is this nature or culture, right? You tend to just know. Instead of it really being a conscious, rational thing, it's just something you have an intuitive felt sense of, which speaks to how deeply it runs for us. And by the same token, nobody really teaches us these things either, right? It's a divide that for the most part, we just pick up from the culture around us. It's kind of implicit in all these ways out there. And for all the power these ideas carry, they're also really problematic in some very important ways. And this is not to say that what we think of as nature is problematic. We're talking about the conceptual categories here rather than the things that are in the categories. First, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of evidence now that this thing we call culture isn't really as unique to humans as we've thought it was, right? So this line between the natural and the culture, the natural and the cultural, is coming to be seen as far less well-defined than we thought of it in the past. Second, and perhaps most important, this split tends to isolate humans from the rest of the world, right? You were just saying this, Karina. The essence of this thing is that people and the things they do are cultural, and then there's this vast ocean of otherness out there that all gets lumped under this huge umbrella of nature, right? And the things that we put in that category, they're not really relatable. Right? We might appreciate them and view them at a distance, but we don't feel the same kind of relations with them that we do with things in the culture category. In fact, historically in the West, relating to this non-human world in the wrong ways has been seen as kind of a dangerous thing, not just to your body, but also to your mind. Going way back, centuries before Freud, madness was seen as the intrusion of these wild animal energies into the human psyche. And Freud actually picked that up, and you see it in his structural model, id, ego, and superego and all that. The id was the wild animal part of us, and the ego and the superego were these cultural forces that were going to tame that wild part. This was really explicit in Freud's writing, this opposition between nature and culture as the fundamental psychological struggle. Right? This famous passage he wrote, where id was, there ego shall be. It is a work of culture, not unlike the draining of the Zuiderzee. The Zuiderzee was this big, shallow inlet of the North Sea in the Netherlands that had been drained and dammed up to control floods and create more land for agriculture. And that was the metaphor, right? The core image that Freud turned to understand the struggles of the human mind. But it's an image of opposition and separation and dominance. Jung picked this up too, by the way, though it kind of evolved and became more nuanced for him over time. You see this in some ways too in the modern conservation movement, though there are shifts happening there. But the model is that you have these stretches of land, right, as with national parks or conservation trusts that are protected from human activity in order to keep them in some kind of pristine state. And mostly we think of that as nature, and where we live as not nature. And of course, we do need to protect many of these places because modern Western life is so destructive of the non-human. But that idea that nature is out there somewhere and culture is here where we live is a geographical, spatial enactment of this conceptual split, right? You can see the way the underlying idea has gotten physicalized or concretized into the very shape of the world, right? Through this notion that there are spaces that are pristine, meaning free from human contact, and that need to be preserved in some pre-human state. But that's also totally out of line with the history of the world. every biome, everywhere in the world, other than Antarctica, has been inhabited and transformed by humans for at least tens of thousands of years, right? Historically, the natural order of things has included humans and human culture living in relation to all the other beings out there. And last point here, this concept of nature as this place out there that is separate from human life has historically been used in the West as a justification for colonialism and racism, especially here in the Americas, right? For a long time, there was this idea that the historian William Denevan called the Pristine Myth, that when European settlers arrived, the Americas were this vast, untouched wilderness there for the taking. And this idea fueled the Manifest Destiny movement of the 19th century. The idea was that since all this bountiful land had been minimally occupied by these savages who just weren't using it to its full potential, then it was God's will that Europeans should move in, take it over, and push forever westward. But it wasn't true. That land hadn't been unused, and it wasn't pristine or untouched. What happened was that the first European explorers showed up, bringing smallpox and other diseases, and within a century, the indigenous American population had been devastated. It's a little hard to know exact numbers, but the estimates are that it was 80 to 95% of the indigenous population dead within a century. I mean, that's an incredible number, right? And then it took another century or two for settlers to really begin arriving. And in that space, vegetation and non-human animals moved back into these spaces that had previously been pretty fully used by the Native American population, sometimes destructively so, actually. So the justification for this was really just false. And we need to be aware when invoking these ideas that they have a legacy which has been at times pretty problematic. And also we, on the more conservation-minded side of things, we need to be careful about this as well, right? Because we've internalized this pristine myth in a different way, in a way that looks backwards to this same period just before European settlers really started to arrive, where the American forest looked so primal and fresh. And that's the ideal that, at least at some level, we often want to get back to. But we too forget that that picture was really complicated and really the result of genocide, right? So we wind up venerating indigenous attitudes and ways of living, and some of them are really wonderful, right? And we have a lot to learn from them. So I'm not trying to take anything away from that. But when you look at the full fabric of indigenous life in the Americas, pre-Columbus, or at least as best as we can reconstruct it, the picture is a lot more complicated. There was tremendous diversity among the peoples who lived here, with a lot of variation in how these different indigenous societies lived and how destructive or not their lifestyles were for the local ecology. So we need to keep that in mind also, because there's certainly a lot wrong with Western thought that contributes to this problem that we're talking about tonight. But this ecological destruction we're seeing, it's also an inherent danger of having a complex, highly populated, and extensively developed society. And that's a reality that we have to navigate, right? We're going to say more about this in a bit, but I really want to challenge this idea that kind of shadows the environmental movement, that we can fix what is wrong with our world by going back in time to some idealized moment in the past. It's a powerful and seductive notion, but it almost always ignores some aspect of reality. So there's a bunch of reasons for us to step out of this divide, right? Especially if we want to have a deeper understanding of how humans operate in and are influenced by their environments. But how? What does the world look like if we're not looking at it through this split? So to answer that, we're going to have to step back and understand a little bit more about the mechanism of how humans relate to their environment, and in particular to the non-human elements. And to really get clear on that, we're going to have to look at some other cultures to get a little insight into how those societies stay more connected to the non-human world. And the broad idea here is that we're going to start to blur these distinctions between culture and nature, right? Start to have cultural relations, cultural kinds of relations with things in the nature category, and sometimes natural relations with the things in the culture category, right? So the lines are just going to blur. And to get there, we can start by, we can kind of start to lay out a general paradigm of how we relate to the non-human. which is really a kind of broader generalization of the things we know about how we relate to other humans. And we're getting this from a mix of psychology principles, what we've observed in other cultures, and some research efforts in this vein. And we might say that the central operative principle here is empathy, right? This is a word that's taken on all kinds of different meanings, but the way I'm using it, I mean it the way that psychologist Carl Rogers talked about it, as a way of putting yourself into the perspective of the other, seeing the world as they do, and understanding their reactions from that perspective. This is how we relate to each other, right? As you talk, I'm taking in your words and your body language and understanding something about your experience by using my own mirroring systems and a healthy dose of imagination to be able to understand where you're coming from. But now we're going to extend that idea a bit to the non-human, which may feel a bit unnatural to us modern Westerners, right? Though, as an aside, the English word empathy originated from a German word, Einfühlung, which applied to the aesthetic appreciation of art and meant a process of feeling into the work of art. So even in the West, this concept has its roots in relations with non-human objects. And so the general idea is that we're going to feel our way into the perspective of some other being. And while most of us have a pretty good idea of how that works with other people, it's less clear how it works with really radically different beings, right? There's a real challenge there around being able to sense what it must be like to be this other kind of subjectivity. And especially for us in the West, because we're so dominated by the intellect. You see that a bit in this cartoon, right? This human skeleton is trying to understand what it's like to be a bat. And asks, the bat says, well, I really can't explain. And then the skeleton is coming at it, making this complicated intellectual philosophical point about mental states and subjectivity and objectivity. And the bat's just thinking about mosquitoes, right? And so they're missing each other. So we need different tools for this than what we're really used to. And the conclusion that a lot of cultures have reached, and also some Western researchers actually, is that the way to do this, there's kind of a trick to it. The way you do it is that you shape your body into the habitus, the physical form, the ways of movement, the life habits of the being whose perspective you're trying to take on. You can try it sometime, when you're in a place where you feel comfortable. Just try mimicking the way an animal is moving, right? Get down on all fours and walk around, get as close to their movement as you can, and just see if it gives you some sense of what the world looks like to them. See if it shifts your perspective at all, maybe give you some insight into why they do the things they do. But this kind of exercise can be challenging for us, right? Like, it makes me a little uncomfortable to think about it. Like, you really have to step outside of your comfort zone to engage in this way, right? There's definitely a voice in my head telling me I'm not supposed to be moving this way, that it's ridiculous or silly. But it's powerful. When you try it, you see that it really does help you get into the perspective of this other. And we should mention this other challenge also, because empathy is really a two-way street. And even if you're quite comfortable feeling your way into some other's perspective, it's a whole different thing to have that other feeling their way into yours, right? You can feel your way into some other perspective and still have that protective idea that you're just pretending that there's another being there, right? But letting yourself feel that other really regarding you, then they really become another being, right? And that throws a wrench into the whole Western nature culture game, where we humans are somehow, conceptually at least, irresolvably separate from the rest of the world, and also the center of things. And let me tell you, it can be an uncomfortable feeling when it happens, when you feel yourself being regarded this way, right? There can be a real existential discomfort in that. So there's more to say on this, but before we dig any deeper into it, we're going to do another exercise here. So you might find your pen and paper. So once again, I'm just going to encourage you to take a moment and just tend to your body here. Plant your feet, get in a comfortable posture, breathe, look at your toes. Now, I want you to think of something non-human that speaks to you, right? This could be a pet, a wild animal, a household object, or the house itself, or some place that feels spirited, and then we're just going to take 5 minutes and just write on these prompts, right? How does it feel in your body to be in relation to that thing or being? What are the interactive cues that give you a sense of being spoken to? Does that experience draw you towards this other or push you away? And what is it like to let yourself feel like you're really being regarded by this non-human other? So let's just take 5 minutes and you can just write down whatever comes up for you. All right. So I wonder what came up for people in this. What kinds of things did you notice?
I'll speak again. I became more aware of the 2 seasons of my life each year, the part of the year that I spent in the city going to school, and the sense of the requirements that social interactions are expected of from us. And it's quite in contrast to being in the country and swimming in the river and walking in the woods, where you feel a sense of a lack of those restrictions, where you can just be totally be yourself and not be concerned about the conventions of social expectations.
Uh-huh. Thank you. Elizabeth, you got your hand up, but you're muted. So
Okay, there. Yeah. So I chose Lake Superior. It's a place I like to go a lot and kayak, and it feels very spirited to me, and I feel very connected to it. But when I think about it speaking to me, or regarding me, it feels a little bit like the mosquito and the bat and the skeleton, because I feel like it doesn't speak to me in any kind of human way, and it doesn't regard me in any kind of human way. But there is a connection.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Joe.
I guess I wondered as I was writing if that stepping into relationship with the other, while if it, well, it does for me, it asks for a certain deflation of ego-centeredness.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and that's not always comfortable.
Mm-mm. Not at all, right? That's the thing, isn't it?
So to be able to step into that more respectful connection and relationship, sort of even going so far as to be in service to the relationship, means sort of stepping out of the center, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Sandy, did you have something?
Yeah, I was noticing, I was writing about my my pets, especially my dog, and thinking about how, and I can't think what the word is, when you personify an inanimate object, where you make it like a little person.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize I do that a lot, that he carries a lot of my projections and the projections of the family. You know, we talk to him and we do little dialogues and we talk for him, you know, and there's this, it kind of, it's less lonely, you know,
Mm-hmm.
having these little creatures around that respond to us. And he was tapping this morning, he woke up and he was tapping his tail on a prayer bowl, and it was like, wow, you know, what a way to wake up, you know.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you. Lolita, we got time for one more. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I love your questions, by the way, because what does it feel in my body to be in relation to, and I'm I live in Wimberley too. Hi, Roberta, by the way. And I'm looking at the hills, and there's such a peace and letting go. And to me, everything is oneness. So I see a shape when I look at my hill that resembles the profile of my boyfriend who died, actually. It's really spooky. And when the last question, what does it feel like when you think you're being regarded by this non-human other? At the beginning, I said, what the heck? This is so weird. I'm not going to do this. I can't do this. And then I look, and it was like a thrilling sensation for the first time. I said, are you communicating with me? And I'm talking about the tree branches moving. Are you talking to me? And it was all of a sudden, this branch of the tree became like a quiet entity communicating with me psychically, or almost. It seemed to tell me, I'm here to soothe you. I'm here in the stillness trying to calm you. I'm taking care of you. And that was pretty, I don't know how, I have goosebumps. This is the first time I even consider this. And I love nature, of course, but yeah, so I'm still in awe. Yes.
Yeah, you really you dropped into it, didn't you? That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing it, Lolita.
Okay.
So we're about halfway through. It's probably a good time to take a quick break, like bathroom break, whatever. Is 5 minutes enough for people? 5 minutes? Okay, great. So we'll see you all back at 8:05. All right. Are people back? Could you just quickly turn your camera on to let us know that you're here? Okay. I think most people are back at this point. So we'll go ahead and continue on here. So I don't normally like to read a lot in these presentations, but this thing we're talking about right now, it's important enough that I want to illustrate what I'm talking about with a passage from an anthropologist named Irving Hallowell, who in the mid-20th century was studying the Ojibwa peoples in the northern US and Canada. And he was one of the first to really dig into the worldviews and ontologies that were underlying the rituals and practices of indigenous peoples. Most other anthropologists at that time were still treating them as primitives whose practices reflected a lack of understanding about the world. But Hallowell was different. And this passage is really going to give us an idea about what this kind of very broad empathy we're talking about looks like in practice and how it links to culture. So here's the anecdote. An informant told me that many years before, he was sitting in a tent one summer afternoon during a storm, together with an old man and his wife. There was one clap of thunder after another. Suddenly, the old man turned to his wife and asked, "Did you hear what was said?" "No," she replied, "I didn't catch it." The old man thought that one of the thunderbirds had said something to him. He was reacting to the sound in the same way as he would respond to a human being whose words he did not understand. The casualness of the remark, and even the trivial character of the anecdote, demonstrate the psychological depth of the social relations with other than human beings that becomes explicit in the behavior of the Ojibwa as a consequence of the cognitive set induced by their culture. So there's a lot in this passage that might stand out to you, right? I mean, just the idea of that you're going to have this conversation with something as far as distant as thunder is really striking, right? And this idea of social relations with other than human beings is also really striking, right? That we can somehow have a felt sense of relationship and community with all these different kinds of beings in the world, right? Even something as foreign and distant as thunder. And Hallowell gives us an idea about how this happens for the Ojibwa, right? In this phrase where he references the cognitive set induced by the culture. And as we're trying to understand more about how we relate to the non-human, and especially if we're wanting to maybe make some changes to that, we need to understand what he's talking about here a bit more, right? Because it's too much to expect every individual to just feel their way into relation with all the other potential beings around them. That's not ever how we've worked as humans. It's more complicated than that. Part of culture is that we receive wisdom about the world, right? And cosmologies that tell us what to look for and how to navigate our world safely, right? This shaman in this picture and this way he's working is probably riffing on an ages-old practice that he received from previous generations. And it reflected the underlying worldview of his society, right? There may be some flexibility to it. He may innovate on it, but he's probably not creating the form of this ritual starting from nothing. And we have a name for these received bodies of wisdom that put together worldviews with ritual enactments, right? We call them mythologies, right? Or at least we call them that when we see them in other cultures. In our culture, when we call something a myth, we mean that it's false, but that's not how I'm using the term. When you're living in a mythology, it doesn't feel false at all. It feels like your culture's best understanding of how the world works. And it lines up all these levels of your being. The intellectual and somatic and emotional, social and perceptual, they all get put into sync with one another in a way that lines up with the worldview and then ritualized into a broad way of being in the world, right? Like how our approach to nature and culture shapes our physical geography, the same thing happens within us, right? Where our consciousness and the way we move in the world take on a shape in line with this underlying mythological worldview. But the entities in a mythology, when it's really alive, you feel them, right? They are living presences. And that sensation of life comes from this confluence of this received body of almost intellectual ideas, the stories, right? But also the way someone living in the mythology has usually unconsciously and automatically learned to shape their perception and the way they move in the world in alignment with that mythology. And so when that Ojibwa couple hear thunder, they hear in a very felt way the living presence of the thunderbirds, not as an abstraction, but as an immediate presence, because they have learned from birth how to enact that perception. So in the way I'm using this word mythology, I really mean a kind of blueprint or schema for relating to the world, usually received from the culture you live in, though it's often riffed on. The way to think about it is as a kind of a tool or aid for developing a sense of empathy with these radically different beings. And so it has an intellectual framework, the stories, which is what we tend to think of when we hear the term, but living mythologies also have bodies of meaningful rituals and practices that help you shape yourself into a mental and physical posture, at least temporarily, where you can see some of what the world looks like from this other perspective, where you can see and understand these other beings. And it's a physical experience, right? This is true also when we empathize with each other, right? You do something, my mirror neurons fire, and in attempting to understand you, my body may start to reflect your posture. At a minimum, the same parts of my brain that would be involved if I were doing whatever I'm watching you do, those parts activate when you have a felt empathic response, right? And if I want to deliberately understand you in a moment, I might consciously mirror my body into what I see your body doing. And so the mythologies help us do this enough to understand these really quite different perspectives. In these indigenous settings, relating to the non-human sometimes looks like a ritualized putting on of the clothes of the other. I think this is a really helpful image to have in the backs of our minds around this. We see that in this picture of the shaman, right? He's trying to cure this patient, and to do so, he puts on a costume that helps him take on the form and therefore the perspective of the spirit that's thought to be making the patient sick, which allows him to communicate and negotiate with the spirit, which can be a dangerous thing. This was the great skill of shamans, by the way, that they could slip into other perspectives and then come back to their humanness. Something to keep in mind is that this kind of mythology is always there in humans. We have it too, right? We have models of the world, a cosmology that defines who and what is real. That's kind of what we're talking about tonight, right? These exercises are really meant to help you bump up against some of the outlines of that in yourself. And for most of us, the mythology that we live in, at least in many areas, it kind of matches these scientific models that we have received, right? We see the world as being filled with all these different entities that we call atom or molecule or quark and so forth. And we have routines for how to enlist them and use them, right? So science kind of fills this role in our society of a mythology. To be clear, I'm not calling science false, like not at all. I want to be really explicit about this. I'm talking about science as a mythology in the sense, not that it's inaccurate or false, but because it defines a roster of entities who we consider real, and because it shapes how we relate to our world. And this, by the way, these relations, they can be cultivated intentionally as well. They're usually received, but they can be cultivated intentionally also. There's an anthropologist named Tanya Luhrmann who's done some really fascinating work with American evangelicals. And what she identified was that many of the practices in those communities are about intentionally, over time, shaping your perceptions of the world so that you can hear the living voice of God all around, right? You're actively practicing, tuning in and hearing God speak to you in this personal and direct way that is very alive when you're in it. Right? This is a form of consciously and deliberately taking control of how you're relating to the world, of forcing yourself into a particular mythological idea about which presences are the correct ones, that you then enforce by adherence to a prescribed set of rituals. And again, you see the confluence of the intellectual, emotional, and somatic here to create a particular perception of the world that's enacted, right? it's also important to note that even though we're talking about this in the context of relations with the non-human, this thing we're calling a mythology, this confluence of ideas about the world, somatic sensations, and emotional reactions that shape our perception of others, is very much at work when we're dealing with other humans also. Right now, at this moment in history, you see this really clearly in the issue of race, right? Race is a complete social construct. There is no way to look at someone's genetic pattern and identify their race. There's no genetic markers for it, right? It's shaped entirely by history and tradition and perception. And in racialized reactions, you see the way that emotion and behavior and perception get molded in these unconscious ways by the ideas and images that we receive from society at large, right? The angry black man, the racist cop, these are received images that shape our perception of things. It's so powerful, and it's mostly unconscious, right? So it can be at odds with our conscious ideals and intentions, but it's very real because it's so widely perceived. And that perception creates a situation where it becomes real because people are reacting to it as though it were. Right. I want to be clear here that I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't see race or even that race isn't real, right? We can notice and celebrate our differences. But what I want to get at here is the way that things can become real through this ongoing process that trains us to see them in the world, even when there's no underlying material basis for it. This is the part our materialist Western minds really struggle with so much, right? And there's a certain feedback quality that happens here, where the more we interact with the world as though these things were real, the more we're able to feel their presence as living entities, and the more real they become for us. So because this underlying mythological schema is so foundational to how a society sees the world, it really becomes an integral part of all of that society's practices, of all its modes of being in the world. Right? We're going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but you can usually see evidence of this underlying worldview in all the different outlets of a society. Not just the mythological stories and the explicit spiritual rituals, but also the everyday practices like transportation, how you get around in the world, food gathering and preparation, medicine, legal systems, architecture, even things like language or the sense of time. And one very important example also is psychopathology. We'll say more about this in a bit, but it's really important to keep in mind that how psychopathology expresses itself, the symptoms that tend to be displayed, is highly culturally dependent and really intimately related to these underlying worldviews. In Freud's time, it often expressed as conversion symptoms, which were people would have seemingly medical conditions, like they wouldn't be able to move their arm, or that they wouldn't be able to talk or something. And the doctors would look at it and not be able to find a problem, but it was expressing as a seemingly organic condition, right? So, and it expressed that way because the way for distress, and especially women's distress, to be taken seriously was to show up physically, right? And what looked like a medical issue. There's a medical anthropologist couple named Joan and Arthur Kleinman out of Harvard who've done some really fascinating work looking at the way these different conditions show up in all these different societies and how that's related to power dynamics. Again, also an expression of the underlying mythology. And treatment of these things also comes from that underlying worldview, right? As we're seeing again in this picture of the shaman. So we're going to step back and do one more writing exercise here before we continue on. So get your pen and paper ready, settle in, plant your feet, get comfortable. Now, call to mind a regular activity in your life that's not an explicitly spiritual or religious practice, right? Might be driving to work, going to the grocery store, something you do every week and it has some emotion, good or bad, associated with it. Just take a minute, give me a thumbs up when you've got it. All right. All right. And so we're going to do a few prompts, and same as before, just write down whatever comes to mind. Just when you hear the prompt. So here we go. First one's going to be, what's going on? First one's going to be, where did you learn this activity? So let's just take 1 minute and jot down whatever comes to mind. All right. So next prompt. What does it feel like emotionally and in your body to be doing this activity, right? As you go about it in your life. And as you hold that activity in mind, what images come up around it? So take another minute and just jot down whatever comes up. All right. And last prompt here. And I'm going to ask, if you get uncomfortable with this one, just use your imagination to make up something, right? So the prompt is, if this activity were a ritual, then what beings or forces would you be relating to through it? So why don't you just take 2 minutes and just write down whatever pops into your head. Don't think too much about it. Just play with it. All right. How was that for people? Anything come up that feels like it needs to be shared here? Wants to be shared? Paul, are you?
You have to raise your hand with the little dot. Okay. You need to do that.
It's okay. It looks like Patricia is trying to say something.
Clapping. Yeah, okay, someone said it. That you were trying to say. Talk. Just talk.
Anyone? Patricia?
Oh, yes. Okay, sorry. We were talking at the same time, which I hear you. So I had an odd, I don't know, this whole thing I've had odd thoughts coming up throughout it. But the most ritualistic part of my life that I can think of is actually exercise. And the way I exercise. And that I learned it as a kid with other kids. We walked to school. We were feral. You know, we ran through fields. We went to the beach in the summer and we walked and ran there. And we were through the trees and knew our way. And so it's all this association with those people that I lived with when I was a child and what that was like, and in the snow and summer. And I had what does it feel like to do it when I exercise? I hear, as I'm writing here, kids yelling, and I saw birthday cake, this very joyous sensation in my body. And when I thought of the forces that I would be interacting with, there are all these mythological women. Medea came up first. Oddly enough, she went after Jason. Diana, Calypso, Circe, the Druids, thunder and lightning, that this very connection to something elemental and deep, all the way to the core of the earth in my body.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, like Roberta, and then maybe Lolita had her hand up after that. Roberta?
Well, I was just thinking of my weekly ritual of feeding my cats. And that's perhaps besides just the regular rituals of getting up and eating and going about things, I make a point every day of going back to my land and feeding my cats. And it's the sense of them coming to the steps and to the edge of the porch and being so happy that I'm there, and I'm happy to pat and rub on them and feel their furriness. And it's this just exchange of love that comes from carrying through on the ritual of responsibility that I learned as a child. So my imagination went back to being with my grandparents in the summer, when my job was to go take the scraps from the meals of the day and take it to the pen where the ducks and geese were that couldn't fly back north. In the summer, they stayed on the eastern shore in the bay, off the bay. And I used to sing to them and they would respond. And I sing to my cats and they respond. So there's a sense of, I think, being taught the joy of taking responsibility for these animals, and it becomes a daily ritual and an exchange of love with them. And I just feel I'm sure they're cats, they're happy to be fed, but it seems like they also just love to be patted and smooched as much as, one does in particular, even before she eats. So it's ritual I love being a part of. The only ritual I can imagine it being connected to is the ritual of communion in the Episcopal Church, where we talk about when 2 or 3 are gathered together. And we all share food together as a sense of communion. And I think for me, fortunately, it also extends to animals. I think it's been a blessing in my life that this has been true.
Mm.
Thank you for bringing it up. I enjoyed remembering it
Thank you
and
for
thinking
sharing it.
about it.
Yeah.
Lolita?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I actually do have a ritual every morning. I'm a writer, so I write morning pages and meditate, etc. But and I learned it, many years ago, just reading a wonderful book that's called The Artist's Way and the Right to Write, Julia Cameron. But to me, it's a relationship with myself. There's an intimacy. There's a flow. There's discovery, and I get hope out of it every single morning. Now, if this were a ritual for me, it is a ritual, and I actually communicate in my mind with God, with my ancestors. My grandparents are right there, with nature, because I'm viewing this beautiful, flowers and trees and hills, and I write about all of them. Yeah, so for me, it is a ritual, and yeah, that's it.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think Kristen had her hand up next, and then Karina.
Okay, I liked this exercise. So I think I have a way of making little rituals out of lots of things. So I tried to think of something that was not particularly special or meaningful in any way. And so I thought of brushing my teeth. And I do brush my teeth, but I don't exactly look forward to it. It's sort of like I need to brush my teeth, before I go to bed or whatever. And so I started thinking about it more, and it's, maybe something like while I'm brushing my teeth, I might think about like my health or things of that nature, or most of the time I probably am just thinking about other things I need to be doing, or it's sort of like an automatic action and not very like thoughtful. So I kind of tried to think about this in a more symbolic way. And so two things that I came away from this that I particularly like, the teeth being part of the skeleton, and like that kind of being this reminder of like the structural like part of the body, and also that sort of being a representation of like a memento mori, and like a reminder of like at some point that's all there will be, and I like that. I like thinking about that on a somewhat frequent basis. I know that might sound morbid, but I think it's encouraging to live better. And then language, the mouth being like how we communicate. And maybe if I was particularly like complaining that day or something, I kind of like the idea of washing your mouth out, or like having, or even maybe giving yourself like the ability to articulate your speech better or something through the act of brushing your teeth. So
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
I liked that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Karina?
Yes. Hi. Sorry, I was waiting for my turn. I wasn't sure if that was me or not. I wasn't going to share, but then someone mentioned exercise, and I thought that was awfully similar to what I wrote, which was going to the gym. And I thought that coincidence did not get lost on me. But I had a slightly different perspective on this whole part, in the sense that I realized going to the gym, I learned from culture around me. It was just the whole idea of being able to fit in with my peers, look good, be attractive. Also the magazines and how the advertisements stress it. And my favorite athletes and my vanity, pure vanity.
Sure.
And then what does it feel like? Like total pain and complete sacrifice and soreness. And so that's why I wanted to share it, because I did not have this mystical running through the woods experience. I had more of a hamster wheel with rocks tied to my neck kind of situation going on. So, and then in terms of who would be relating through in this experience, I mean, I kind of basically I devoted to my health, and so all the goddesses and gods of healthcare, because that's basically what I feel like is probably more of a reliable system than what we have going on right now. Sure. And my ancestors who were riddled by all kinds of diseases and stuff. So I honor them by taking care of myself. And that's my primary motivator. The vanity part was when I was younger, but now it's just basically to just stay healthy and honor my ancestors.
Sure. That's great. Thank you, Karina.
Thank you.
All right. So we're a little tight on time, so I'm going to move on, and got just a few more slides here. I want to talk in a little bit more depth about what the mythology looks like that we modern Westerners live in, right? And if a mythology is what helps us relate to the non-human, and we Westerners have one, then why do we feel so distant from the non-human world, right? This is really the question we're coming to. And the answer is complicated, but we're going to dig into it a little because I think it's important to what we're seeing. So the central image in modern Western mythology, really since the Enlightenment and Descartes and continuing today, has been the machine, right? You see this really strongly in the deists in the 18th century, including many of this country's founding fathers, who thought of the universe as a giant watch, and God was the watchmaker, like God had just created this giant mechanism, wound it up, and then was just standing back and watching it all unfold according to mechanical principles. And ever since then, the machine, in an increasingly dominant way, has been the central image through which we see and relate to the world. Right? We look at the world as a giant machine. We look at animals and plants and biomes and even human bodies as machines that we can break down into these basic soulless constituent parts, and then look at the dynamics of how they work together. And this is tied up with the nature-culture split too, right? Nature, for us at least conceptually, even if it's not personally, it's kind of become the realm of mechanism in terms of the philosophical thought out there, right? It's the realm that doesn't have any will or intention or soul, right? Just all this matter bumping around. And over the centuries, this view has crept into all these different places. Psychology, for example, so that even our personal experience of the world has kind of gotten reduced to a ghost in the machine. And to be clear, it's not wrong to look at the world as a machine, right? It's clearly been a really powerful way of approaching things. It's given us the internet, cell phones, and airplanes, and Zoom, cars, but it's limited, right? It's one perspective. It's not the only one. And it's a perspective that has the significant downside that it always takes us away from the intelligence that pervades things. When you're looking at the world through the lens of the machine, you cannot perceive intelligences because it all just gets reduced to mechanics, right? And mechanics is about dead matter. Everything clicking along in some predictable way, right? So as long as our relations with the non-human are dominated by these images of machines and the practices and ways of thinking about the world that come from that image, it's going to be difficult for us to really step into a way of regarding the world where we see these other intelligences all around. I'm just going to ask that everybody mute yourself and if you're not asking a question or whatnot, just to keep down on the noise. Thank you. So how do we get out of this? Right? How do we approach the world from a perspective that sees it as more than just a giant machine? Well, it's hard. Let's acknowledge that. It's hard. It's probably harder now in the present day than it ever has been at any point in human history. And the reason it's gotten so much harder is that most of us in the West live in human-constructed, physical, intellectual institutional, social environments that constantly reinforce the image of the machine, right? This image in the background, this city, it looks like a giant machine, right? It's orderly and structured, everything's straight lines. This, by the way, was a design by the famous urban planner, Le Corbusier, who kind of defined the ethos of 20th century urban planning. And he called streets traffic machines, right? And he referred to houses as machines for living. So this image of the machine is really woven into the very physical fabric of modern life. I mean, think about your day-to-day life, right? How many homages to the machine do you perform on a daily basis? You're driving in your car, you're using the internet, you're running your dishwasher, medical procedures, even going to the grocery store, right? We live in this world where the ways of life that we have received and that we further develop are all oriented around the machine. And just like a muscle that you flex over and over again gets stronger and stronger, when you look at the world over and over and over again through the same lens, that mode of relating gets stronger and stronger. It becomes our habituated way of being. It's part of how this whole system becomes self-reinforcing, right? We've built our modern world as a temple to the machine, and we worship in that temple every single day. We worship the machine every day. And this meshes well with the world of therapy. And all the therapists in the room have probably had the experience of people coming in and they're doing some great work, right? They're feeling things they weren't feeling before. They're getting insight, and then they go back out into the world and they just revert to the old patterns, right? This was the key insight of the family systems movements, that to get real change, you had to treat the system. You had to really understand and address the dynamics of the system as a whole. So there wasn't so much pressure on the individual to fall back into old patterns, right? How many of you have had this experience? A while back, I spent a week alone backpacking in the Pecos Wilderness outside of Santa Fe, and it was great. By the end of the week, I felt totally in sync with that non-human world. I had slowed way down. I was noticing the birds and all the different animals, and really appreciating things around me in a new way. And then I came back down to everyday life, and it went away. Like, not immediately, but over the course of a month or so, I found myself back in the grind of machine life. I bet many of you had that experience, right? Like, you go on vacation and you come back, and before you know it, you're back in the grind. So we need to understand that there are systemic pressures that are out there and that push people back into mechanical modes of relating, which really tend to distance us both from ourselves and others, right? And we need to be asking ourselves how we can shift those pressures. And the good news from the point of view that we're talking about tonight is that you get all kinds of levers to do this, right? Because this mode of relating shows up in all of these different avenues, we can start to shift it and make it more nuanced through pretty much any channel where it shows up, right? You see this in mindfulness practices, that you can really start to shift your attitude by just putting your attention on these small day-to-day things, and then build over time, right? The big systemic changes are great. We want to get those eventually too, but there's always work to do in these smaller ways in the here and now. And personally, I just find this so hopeful, right? This thing we're talking about can just feel like such a massive, overwhelming problem. And to know that I can work on it by cultivating these practices for myself and by talking about it to other people, that feels a lot more hopeful to me. So you may be thinking, wow, this is interesting and all, but what does it have to do with psychology? I mean, psychology is supposed to be about how we think and feel and all those aspects of human subjectivity, right? And we're talking about shamans and mythologies and the machine, but how does any of this tie together? But here's the thing, right? You're not just a person in isolation. You're a being in a world. And the boundary between your being and that world is far more porous than the major traditions of Western thought have historically acknowledged. Right? In fact, that world creates most of the circumstances of your life at a really foundational level. Right? It trains you how to think and talk and be, and it continues to shape those things throughout your life. The very shape of human subjectivity, of human consciousness, is in many ways determined by those external circumstances. For the Western mind, this was one of the big lessons of the intellectual movements of the 20th century. Everything from psychoanalysis to postmodernism was looking at the ways that human subjectivity was shaped by context. That's true both developmentally and on an ongoing basis as adults. We talked a little earlier about this relational movement in psychoanalysis, going from a one-person psychology to a two-person psychology. But what we're talking about tonight is the need to really take this a step further, going from a two-person psychology to a person in the world psychology. And yeah, that world includes all the other people around, but also everything else, right? Plants and animals and freeways and downtown buildings and legal systems, even time itself. And when you grow up in a particular world and continue to live in that world, the impact of all these things runs very deep, so deep that we're often not aware of it until we're confronted with it in some way. I'm gonna skip ahead here a bit because we are pretty short on time. Right. So I think this is really important. One of the, well, an example of this, when my kids came along, one of the many things that they taught me was how unnatural my sense of time was, right? This way that we slice time up into little parcels and we're all supposed to move like clockwork, be here at this time and then there and there and there and there. And it's the machine again, right? All these pieces have to interlock just so, like the gears of a clock. And my kids, when they were young, had no sense of any of this, right? You parents in the room would probably had this experience, right? That they were just in their animal bodies and doing whatever it was their sense of themselves told them they needed to, without any reference to this external clock. And it was a really hard thing to come up against because I get really activated by it. I get frustrated with them for making us late to things or messing up some schedule I had set up. And to get out of that, I had to realize both how unnatural this time paradigm was that I was working in and how deeply it ran in me, how much I had yoked my own animal body to it. And it had created this sense of distance within myself. And that distance was really grounded in fear about what would happen to me if I didn't keep to this schedule, right? And I think that's really important for us to remember that modern humans, when we're in the machine, it's an experience that's grounded in fear. You know, and you can contrast it because, you know, like in the time example, it's not like plants and animals and seasons or even babies don't have a sense of time, right? My dog knows it's 6 p.m. every evening and will lead me to her food bowl like clockwork. But it's different, right? Her sense of time is coming from this internal place, this confluence of sensations of hunger and some awareness of when things usually happen. But it's not fear-based. But we modern humans, when we're in the machine, that's an experience that's grounded in fear, right? Something bad is going to happen if we don't hit our next mark. And that fear keeps us from being able to slow down enough to really relate to the world around us. This clip we're seeing here, by the way, probably some of you recognize it. It's from an old Charlie Chaplin movie called Modern Times. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth watching because it's, it's hilarious. And it's this kind of comic indictment of the things we're talking about. In this scene, Chaplin is a factory worker and they're testing out this new machine to feed him in his place on the assembly line to save time and improve efficiency. And of course, it just goes comically wrong and he just has to kind of endure it. So that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. All right, I'm gonna just skip ahead because I know we're very tight on time here. I want to just bring in this idea of psychopathology just to close with, right? The point of all this for psychology is that we need to understand that people live in and develop in a context of patterns of relating to the world, right? And we tend to think of psychopathology as just some problem in the individual with how they're relating or processing emotion or whatever. But we need to always remember that that pathology, whatever it is, it doesn't just involve an individual, right? But an individual in a context. Person in the world. And I believe that we need to be treating our pathologies as kinds of canaries in the coal mine. They don't just mean, oh, this person has generalized anxiety disorder, whatever, right? We need to be understanding that anxiety in relation to the world that individual lives in. This isn't my idea, by the way, but I'm getting it from a bunch of other people, James Hillman and others. And this is where all this ties in with what we've discussed about mythologies, right? because we tend to think of mythologies as static things. But really, they only look that way in the rearview mirror. When they're living, they're in constant evolution. We look back on Greek mythology or whatever, and it looks like just this fixed set of things, right? But the historical reality is that there was a constant friction of different stories, different versions of stories, different ways of relating to the world that were competing over time. And we see the ones that won out, that became dominant, but we miss the process that produced that picture. And I want to suggest that pathology, physical, mental, spiritual, it doesn't matter. Pathology is one of the drivers of changes to these patterns of relating. It is part of how energy for change gets created in these systems. Something isn't working in our relationship with ourselves or other people or the world at large. And experientially, we know that's happening because we feel suffering. And that suffering points back to some underlying problem with how we're engaged with the world. And when those problems involve relations with other people, we change how we relate to them, right? We set boundaries or practice asking for what we need from people, whatnot. But when they involve things that are not so natural for us to relate to, the kinds of things we really rely on these mythologies to help us with, then we need to be looking at the ways that that mythology might be falling short. So when Freud came across sufferings in the form of conversion symptoms that didn't fit the scientific model of the time, that indicated some other kinds of players at work, he had to go and invent this whole other mythology of id, ego, and superego, complete with psychoanalytic rituals of how to interact with those forces in the consulting room and a priesthood that could guide people in this way. Same thing with Jung. He had his big experiences that became the Red Book, and then he had to go and come up with a different mythology that matched what he was seeing, again, with rituals and a priesthood for interacting. And so all of these sufferings of the world ultimately are a sign of pathology in the system. And we need to be asking ourselves as we see this pathology, and maybe especially psychopathology, what problem with relating to the world does that condition point to, right? What is it keeping us from feeling about the world? What changes is it demanding of the underlying mythologies that dominate this system? And what is getting in the way of this person who's experiencing this suffering, being able to enact the kinds of broader change that would shift this way of relating in the world, right? If all our work as therapists or healers is just to help individuals adjust themselves to broken mythologies, then we're doing the world a disservice. If we're just trying to help people live in this machine without equipping them with the tools to create a more relational world, then we're missing the boat, right? And to bring this back around to where we started, and we'll wrap up, with this divide between nature and culture. One of the problems I see with the modern environmental and eco-psychological movements is that they haven't broken out of this divide, right? They're still seeing these as separate realms. You look at the ecotherapy literature, and much of it is about this kind of Edenic return to nature, without any real examination of what that term means. And so you see that in the interventions out there. So where you get everything from a wilderness trek to working your garden, all get thrown into the bucket of connecting to nature. But those are really different activities, right? And we need to understand that the common thread connecting them is that they are ways of stepping out of the machine and relating with an ensouled world, which is really the counter image to the machine. And those connections with animals and plants and whatnot are wonderful, but we also need to remember that we can create a culture, a society where we live in social and built environments, where we can have similar types of experiences in a sustainable and everyday way, right? We don't have to live in environments that reinforce the machine, even when we're using technology. With the right ethos and an understanding of the kinds of aesthetics that produce a sense of connection with the world around us, we can foster this sense of community and connection with the non-human in our everyday lives, right? This is a kind of beauty that has enormous potential to shift the way that we think and feel about the world. And so we on the environmentally friendly side need to be making friends with technology in this way, right? Rather than always looking backward in this kind of going back to the garden kind of way, right? We can't go back. There's no backwards, unfortunately. We've got to figure out how to move forward constructively. All right, I know we're over time. I appreciate your patience with me. And if you have any feedback, questions, comments, please feel free to email me here. And I know we might be a little late for questions here.
Yeah, maybe we can hold off on the question.
Sure.
Maybe let's just do a couple of closing announcements. I know we have about 4 minutes. And then maybe we have time for a question.
Okay.
But I think mostly I don't know if Melinda's there. I think Melinda was going to say something as a closing remark and just let people know what's going on in the next couple months.
Yeah, for sure. So we have some events coming up over the next few months. One, I'm very excited to share. I'm going to be facilitating a 9-week series class focusing on the journey of individuation. And that starts, it's going to be Sunday afternoon/evenings from 4 to 6, starting July 18th and running through September 19th. So you can find more information about that on the website, or if you're on our email list, we've been sending out some announcements about it, registration via Eventbrite. And we're also going to be celebrating in July Jung's birthday on Saturday, the 24th, out here in Wimberley. Several of us are joining from Wimberley. So we're going to have a bonfire and a call to create. So that should be a fun gathering. Hope you can join us. And then in September, we're very excited to have Dennis Slattery back for the Myths of Belief, a lecture and workshop. So that'll be Friday, September 24th, lecture and workshop on Saturday, the 25th. So hope you can join us for those, and thanks for being here tonight.
There's no August meeting, right?
Correct, except for the ongoing class. Yep.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm done.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. It's 8:58. Maybe if you caught all that and marked your calendar, we have time for maybe a question if someone wants to ask. But I would say officially class dismissed. Karina, I know you had your hand up. Go for it.
Yes, I put it back up there. I'm so proud of myself. I figured out how to raise hand. It's like the highlight of my day today. So I do have a question. So you mentioned fear is this driving force behind this machine world we live in. And I've noticed that a lot of what's being done in the field of psychology, and this is my humble opinion and some ideas that I have shared with people I have recently come across with. So this is not like, this didn't just come to me, but it seems that the field of psychology recently has been dealing with symptoms, right? Fear management. Versus getting to the root of it. So my question is it possible, how probable is it that psychology will get a little bit more confrontational and face on the root causes of the fear? Because you know, like a lot of these methodologies are all about management. They're not about like what it is, you know, they're not going deeper than what it is that they're really about, right? And is it possible to alchemize this fear into excitement and having, you know, change the world that way, from the bottom up instead of top down approach?
Right. Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think you're right that so much of certainly mainstream psychology seems to be about symptom management rather than really tackling underlying issues. I mean, that's one of the things that I mean, in-depth psychology as a tradition, people have tried to go a little deeper, and there've been various movements there to try and tie it more to the world, and eco-psychology included, which this is all kind of building on, is one of those. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely people out there who agree with you. I don't have the answer to how we do that. I wish I did, but yeah, I think there are people working on it.
Yeah. Hopefully there will be a methodology or two that will come out of this, and we'll be able to get a more of an in-depth approach towards it, because if I told you how much time I spent on managing my symptoms and I'm nowhere near, right? So and then do you think it's possible, since it seems like we're running out of time with this, especially with ecological issues and in our nature and all that stuff, is it even possible to raise empathy on a collective level without a conscious involvement of a lot of the masses? And how do we do that? Because I mean, if it
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's possible, actually. I mean, it's one of the things that we kind of ran out of time, and I didn't get in as far into it as I want to. But I mean, I think there's a lot about how we built our world, right? Like when you walk through the streets of Paris, it's a different feel than when you walk through the streets of downtown Austin, right? There's a texture to the experience that I think when you live there in that, you're kind of engaging in that way all the time, right? And that's one of the things in American life, especially. I think we've built our environments in a way where they reinforce this isolation, right? I mean, think about how much time people spend in their cars on the freeway, right? We've all got our little metal bubbles, and we're competing with each other. And when you contrast that with the kind of relationships you'd have on like mass transit, where you're there and you're kind of in relation with everybody else there, it's a very different feel. And I think when you live in an environment where you're having to encounter others consistently like that, by others, I also mean like buildings that feel responsive, right? That's part of it also. Then I think it does, like it tends to increase your level of empathy. So,
okay, so would that be a responsibility of all of us to make sure that we consciously connect with the people around us, that even if we don't feel like it, or we try to alchemize those conflicts that arise from our daily interactions, right? I feel like it really comes down to that at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to, whatever our private frustrations and whatnot, we have to kind of be constructively taking them into public life, right? Which is a delicate thing, because you can take it in ways that aren't constructive as well. But really, it needs to be more than just us introspecting on ourselves. And
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like all hands on. It just feels like it's all hands on deck at this point. And it's, I mean, I could sit for hours in my room working on myself, but I just feel it's not about me anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Yeah.
So Jason, is there a way for people to continue this conversation with you with email, or is there any way to reach you?
Absolutely. You can email me at, I'll put it here in the chat. Just jason@jasonsugg.com. There's also a contact me form on my website if you want to get in touch and share your thoughts or whatever about it.
Thank you so much. I'd like to have us be able to stay here for another hour and spend time with you. So I want to honor.
Yeah.
Yes. My apologies. I lost track of time as per usual in these meetings.
Thank you.
No worries.
We're good. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Jason.
There you are.
Melinda, can you hear me?
Yes, I texted you.
Oh,
I'd love to get together.
yeah. Okay. I don't know how, but you have my email. Email me.
Yeah, I send you a text on your phone, but I have that faster than your email.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Just send you one.
All right. Perfect.
Uh-huh.
All right.
It's good to see you.
Fantastic.
We're still recording, it looks like, Daniel.
Oh, yeah. How do I stop that?
Great.